As we begin to talk about Beowulf, we begin to look at what makes an epic poem defined as an epic. In its simplest definition, an epic is a lengthy narrative poem telling a story of heroic deeds accomplished by a superhero and told in a dignified, formal way. A folk epic is composed orally and passed from storyteller to storyteller. So we see here that there are three main pieces to the definition of an epic. First, that it's this lengthy narrative poem. Narrative is important there. It tells a story. It has a plot. There is a hero, and not just your run-of-the-mill brave knight. This is a superhero who's going to be able to do things that normal humans can't do. And then the way in which it is told. It's a very dignified, formal retelling meant to match the greatness of the heroic deeds. Now, all folk epics are epics. However, all epics are not folk epics. So folk epics are those ones that are passed down from generation to generation, typically to be able to preserve some of the culture of the time. The history of Beowulf as an epic is fairly interesting. It's composed around 700 AD, but the action of the poem takes place earlier, around 500 AD. Throughout the poem, the poet is reviving the heroic language, style, and values, and especially the pagan values of ancient Germanic oral poetry. So you will hear references to monsters and goblins and ghosts and, certainly some of that idea of idol worship, the pagan worship before Christianity takes hold. It deals with the ancient Germanic forebears, so the Danes and the Geats. Only a single manuscript of the poem survived the Anglo-Saxon era. And in the 1700s in London, it's nearly destroyed by the Great London Fire. In fact, when you go and see it today, you can still see kind of like the singeing around the burned edges. It's not until 1936 when J.R.R. Tolkien, and of course you know that name from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, he publishes a paper on the poem, talking about Beowulf's place in British cultural history, and that's when it really begins to become popular again, and scholars begin to take another look at the work and recognize it for its contribution. What do we know about the author of Beowulf? We know that the poet is Christian, because we can see the way in which he attributes Beowulf's greatness to Christ and his Christianity. We also see his references to Grendel, the monster, as this pagan being. It definitely reflects a very established Christian tradition. So we can assume that when the poet is writing, Christianity has been the dominant religion of the land for some time. However, it's definitely going to reference that pagan history. Definitely some allusions to the Old Testament. There are some allusions to Cain and Abel. Beowulf is seen as a redeemer in the poem, who is sent by God to save man from sin. So lots of references to Beowulf as this Christ-like figure. Of course, the price of salvation is life itself. So there's lots of correspondences between Beowulf's death and the death of Christ. The author of Beowulf is anonymous. We're not sure who, originally came up with the idea. Again, because it's a folk epic, it's been passed down through many years. So we're not exactly sure of the true identity. So the author is anonymous, but we know a little bit about kind of the culture that he would have been coming from. Epic conventions are elements of an epic poem that we see across all epics. So these are the characteristics that we're going to be looking for. There's always an opening statement of theme. This idea, the purpose of the epic, what the author's intended meaning is. There's typically an appeal for supernatural help in telling the story, some sort of invocation, and this is definitely a pagan element. So they are really falling back on what Greek epics do as well, where they would ask the gods for help telling the story. We see that here in this epic as well. It begins in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. So it doesn't begin at the very beginning with Beowulf's birth or Grendel's coming to England. Instead, it's going to begin right in the middle of the action. So the opening scene of Beowulf is Grendel the monster coming into the great hall and snatching up men and eating them right away. So it really begins right in the middle. You'll see long lists, catalogs of people and things, and this is done primarily for entertainment. Lots of accounts of past events. So Beowulf will talk about his father's history, or Hrothgar, the king of the Geats, will talk about his past triumphs. And this is a way to pass on historic events to the next generation that are listening to the poem. And lots of descriptive phrases. I mean, remember that Beowulf is originally passed down orally. So they've got to use language to paint the picture. As far as the poetic devices that we will be looking at, in ancient times, poetry has to entertain people. And so they really followed a lot of these conventions for the oral performance. Alliterative verse is going to be used throughout, and we all remember what alliteration is. So we're really forming sentences, lines, based on the consonant sounds. A caesura, which is a pause for breath, very important in oral storytelling. And then we have kennings. I love kennings. Kennings are a two-word poetic renaming of a person, place, or thing. So rather than say, the ocean, we might say it's the whale's home. Rather than say, room 201 is Miss Hudson's room. A kenning for that might be, I don't know, Hall of Greatness. That seems to be right. So that's what a kenning is. And next, you will go on to learn more about Beowulf as an epic hero.